thank you. Yeah, we can we'll sit in the middle here. Right, well, I am delighted to be continuing this conversation with Dr. Cary Fowler, Special Envoy for Global Security at the U.S. Department of State, and Afshan Khan, who's the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Coordinator of the Scaling Up Nutrition, or SUN movement. So thank you both for being here today. So food security, it's a big topic. And Cary, I'd like to start with you. We have a lot of these convenings around the world, high-level meetings talking about hunger and food security, yet still millions of people are going hungry every day. What aren't we doing that we should be doing?
What are we not doing that we should be doing? Well, quite a lot. But I'll point out a couple of things and maybe end on a hopeful note as well. I think we typically, I think as human beings, we are hardwired to look at immediate threats, and we are not hardwired to look at long-term threats or solutions. So I do believe that going forward, we need to put more energy and thought and investment into the kind of solutions that we're going to need long-term, lest we continue to grow the humanitarian need. It already outstrips our ability to deal with it. It's going to get worse. So we need to look at the long term. We also need to look at the fundamentals, which I think have to do with crop adaptation, particularly to climate change, and they have to do with building good, fertile soils. We're going backwards in the soil front. And finally, I think on the positive side, and I'd be interested to hear what Afshan says about this, I do sense a bit of a turn in the direction of people noting the fact that actually we need to talk about nutrition security, not just food security. And those can be, in some people's minds, two different things. And for nutrition security, I think the implication would be that we invest more in diverse farming systems. We invest more in the kinds of foods that provide micronutrients for children to prevent the awful scourge of stunting, for example. So let me end there.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're looking to achieve with VAX, which for those who are less familiar with this initiative, the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, which launched last year. So can you talk a little bit about what you are hoping this will do to help further those goals?
Sure. Well, when we started this Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, focused on Africa, where the greatest need is, and we wanted to do something that had the greatest potential to deal with these nutrition and food security problems. And that drew us to looking at traditional and indigenous crops, for which there's been so little investment over the years for all the wrong reasons. That, I think, has taken off. We've gotten a number of countries involved in this, number of UN agencies and others. In the beginning, what we said and what we still say is that we need to change hearts and minds. We need to change thinking about this. We can no longer aim our agricultural and food security programs towards simply producing more calories. We are dealing both with a climate crisis that's going to have a huge impact on food production, greater and more critical than I think most people realize, but we're also dealing with this crisis of childhood stunting and nutrition. I'll just say one word about that, which is that in many countries we see stunting rates of 30 or 40% of children under 5, which means a cognitive decline and a physical decline impact for the rest of their lives. And I simply invite you to think of what the challenge would be for any of your societies out there, United States, Europe, any country, if you had a rising generation where 30% of the children were stunted mentally and physically. It would present insurmountable obstacles to economic development. It would contribute to instability, and we would not tolerate it. This is the world we live in. We don't want to increase those statistics in the wrong way. So we really have to focus on not just improving production in the face of climate change, but improving nutrition.
Thank you. And Afshan, so the Sun Movement is looking to transform the food system through a nutrition and climate lens. So where are you seeing that? And Cary mentioned nutrition being really kind of like the bedrock of development, right? Not just food security, but development broadly. So what are you seeing, and are you sharing that optimism of that really taking hold within the broader food system conversation?
I think, first of all, I would just say it's a unique moment with more attention on nutrition and food security than we've seen in a while. And I really liked Ambassador Fowler's reference to food and nutrition security. Because if we don't have good, nutritious foods, Ambassador Fowler has already spoken about the issues around stunting for children. I'd like to add to that anemia for women, loss of productive potential, but also even girls in schools with high rates of anemia missing out opportunities to learn. So the intersection between food production and food consumption and nutrition, we're really at a pivotal moment. And partly that's due to climate change. It's partly due to the fact that we need a very rapid investment in some of the crops that have perhaps been paid less attention to in the past, that are indigenous crops that can produce quality, nutritious food at an affordable price. So that's where the Sun Movement, and as part of that, the Sun Business Network in particular, that's led by GAIN and WFP, is looking to see how can we encourage local production of quality, nutritious foods. VAC has focused on soil and crops, and that's incredibly important at one point of the value chain. But what we're also seeing is that investment across the value chain, longer term, to be able to ensure that not only is there production of that food, but if I see 30% of climate of emissions are due to food loss and waste. And a lot of that waste is associated with fresh vegetables and fruits that are produced on the African continent, but many women lose a significant percentage of that production by not being able to get it to market in a timely way, where we see spoilage or we're seeing even difficulties to access markets. So that's why I think the sudden coalescing we're seeing around interest in food production, interest in indigenous crops that are high and nutrient dense in value, an ability to influence inputs so those crops can be produced, and those that are producing them, because the rate of undernutrition among smallholder farmers is also close to 30-40%. So we have to look at this in a comprehensive way. From a social justice angle, those who are producing our food should not be undernourished. But from an economic angle, it makes no sense if your farmers, and many of these farmers and smallholder farmers are women, are also malnourished. So at the movement, we're really seeing a unique opportunity to have a better intersection between nutrition and food security, to look at mitigating some of the climate risks, and for building what I think one of the previous speakers talked about, stronger resilience for being able to mitigate risks and disasters due both to climate change and conflict, where this intersection now between food, nutrition, and climate allows us really to have less of a short-term vision and more of a longer-term vision of where do we need to go to improve production of nutritious foods, and to make sure that we're addressing the chronic issue of stunting and micronutrient deficiencies.
And where do you see the role of, big food, big ag in this picture? Obviously, a lot of the big corporations are a contributor to at least poor nutrition and some of their foods, but also provide a lot of that scale. There's a real opportunity there. And so how do you see working with big food to transform, whether it's the the crops that they use, and just where do they sit at this table of trying to integrate more nutrition into our food system?
I think for the agricultural industry, I'll ask Dr. Fowler to speak to it because I think he's far more connected to that. When I look at what the impact has been of large food production companies on malnutrition, I think there's a couple of things we have to bear in mind and some statistics that might be somewhat shocking. While the number of stunted children is still very high, there have been some important declines. We're still far off the SDG target, but we're seeing a growing rate of obesity and overweight, including among low-income countries in poorer communities. So what we really also need to address is the broader ecosystem that's there for food production, but food distribution. So I think when it comes to big ag, and we're looking at, what kind of inputs are provided to farmers at what cost, there's a whole series of issues there that need to be resolved. The second is there's a very heavy dependence on, maize, rice, corn, wheat. That ignores a lot of the indigenous crops that can be produced locally, brought to market, and even converted into things like nutritious infant food or feeding that could be really useful for complementary feeding for children between that age of, I would say, 9 months and 2 years of age, when they're most at risk of stunting. Because they're shifting off the breast, and I want to reemphasize the importance of breastfeeding as a first food that's so key to addressing longer term stunting. But how do we get those small and medium enterprises supported in a way at the local level so they can scale? And I think that's some of the work that GAIN and WFP are doing in countries where they're working, but they really need a better alignment with the private sector. And then lastly, on the private sector, I think some of the standards need to be set vis-a-vis what's the portion of their production and distribution and sale of food, particularly in low-income countries or middle-income country markets, that's nutritious food. And that's where the Access to Nutrition Initiative, that's a partner of the Sun Movement, is so important to set some guidelines for industry so we don't start flooding poor economies with junk food that's high in sugar or high in trans fat and high in salt, because the longer term implications of that on disease are significant. And we'll just be punting down the road a real issue of dealing with overweight and obesity and break health systems that are already too fragile to deal with the current levels of stunting and wasting.
Thank you. And Dr. Fowler, I'd love to get your perspective on this, and particularly from the policy angle of how policy can help really encourage the largest part of our food system, some of these big food producers, to integrate this more into their supply chain. And then I know we don't have that much time left. I would also love to hear what you both have hope to see in the Nutrition for Growth Summit that's coming up next year.
Well, let me start and go back just a second. I loved everything that Afshan said. In the future, I'll cede all of my time to her. She can. Some of the big companies are stepping up now. I'll just name some names: ADM, Bayer, Cargill, Corteva, IBM. Are a number of countries that have companies that have actually seen what we're doing to promote some of these indigenous crops, high nutrition-rich crops. And improve soils, and they've stepped up and joined us in this. So I think there is a new day afoot. We need to, of course, on one of the things that we're going to lean on and I think be dependent on some of the big companies going forward, and it has a policy dimension to it, is we're going to need to invest much, much more than we're investing now in agricultural research. That's kind of fallen out of favor among a lot of policymakers who say, well, we can't afford to do anything that's that long term because we have an immediate problem now. But we know that faced with the kind of climate headwinds that we have, that we're going to need agricultural research, not just to increase production, particularly of these types of crops that we haven't invested in the past that we think of as opportunity crops, but just to maintain the production we have now. We'll need more. And on an inflation-adjusted basis here in the United States, even we are spending the same amount on public agricultural research as we did 50 years ago. By the way, that's much less than a single corporation would spend. So we need to harness that kind of technology and abilities. And we need, frankly, to invest in some moonshots. We haven't had any quantum leaps in agricultural production for a half century. That's probably not going to suit us very well going forward.
Well, I know we only have maybe 1 minute left, but again, I'd love to hear what would be your hopes for, particularly when many of this room may be gathering at the Nutrition for Growth Summit next year, to see it happen in that room. Afshan.
I'll be very quick. This is your business. I still think that we have a long way to go in changing the conversation and putting nutrition at the center of what we're talking about. If we think about creating nutrition security, not just food security, I'm making a little bit of a distinction here, but if we think of nutrition at the center of our food security as being the goal of every good food system, then it changes the way you analyze, it changes your prescription of what needs to be done, it changes your time frame. So I think that type of focus on nutrition first is what needs to be embedded in policy discussions in development agencies at the UN, et cetera.
Afshan?
Thanks. I think to pick up on Ambassador Fowler's point, I'd just like to say, food systems without nutrition is kind of like air without oxygen. It's not going to help serve populations to develop and grow. And so when I look forward to both the global gathering that we're having in Kigali in November as a Sun movement, it's an opportunity to bring together the 66 countries that form part of that movement to really start defining much more clearly as governments, alongside civil society partners, alongside small and medium enterprises and the UN agencies, how are we going to better put nutrition into health systems, into food systems and agriculture, through education and some of the work that's being done through school feeding, and in social protection systems. So ultimately we're giving the opportunity for every child to reach their full potential, but every woman and every community that is producing food to actually have the opportunity to have good nutrition themselves. So nutrition for growth is an opportunity, I think, as Ambassador Fowler said, to really put this politically back on stage so that we're not just talking about food security, but food and nutrition security. And for climate change, we have a clear set of actions as to the intersection between climate and nutrition and what can be done to improve resilience and reduce risks.
Well, Dr. Fowler and Afshan, thank you so much for your time. Speaking of food, we are going to have a little networking break. There are some snacks in the back, and then we will continue the conversation after that, moving into our next track on innovating for global health and well-being. So again, thank you both for joining us today, and enjoy a few moments to network, and then we'll be back shortly.